The Battle of Endor was one of the Empire's defining defeats in the war against the Rebel Alliance. But how did the Imperial forces actually lose when they had every advantage possible? Their plans were working perfectly because they had the Rebel fleet trapped in a theater of their choosing. They also had more ships, better equipment, powerful Sith Lords in control, and an operational Death Star. Yet somehow, against all odds, the Rebels and their teddy bear allies managed to win. After some in-depth research, I have an idea. In this video, I'm going to take you through 5 reasons that explain why the Empire lost despite its overwhelming force. Trust me, it's not just because the good guys always win. A key reason why the Empire lost at Endor was that they underestimated their opponents. This is clear on so many levels because they had so many advantages. They successfully lured the rebels to Endor by leaking the existence of a new Death Star. When Admiral Ackbar's fleet jumped out of hyperspace, they faced overwhelming firepower. The Empire had a functional Death Star laser, an Executor-class Star Destroyer, 30 Imperial-class Star Destroyers, and many more supporting ships. According to Star Wars on the Front Lines, the Republic only had about 20 Mon Calamari Star Cruisers at its disposal, including 4 MC-80A Home 1 Type A Heavy Star Cruisers. The Rebel ships had a speed advantage, but the Empire had superior firepower, and this was their turf. It was the same situation on the ground. There was a full garrison of stormtroopers waiting for the rebels to land and attempt to sabotage the shield generators. Yet, despite this, they still lost the battle. Unfortunately for the Empire, they underestimated the rebels on land and in space. The most obvious example is with the Ewoks. These small, furry bipeds only had Stone Age technology when the Empire invaded their moon. The canon junior novel, Return of the Jedi, Beware the Power of the Dark Side, reveals how the Imperials raised an Ewok village to construct their shield generator complex. They also gunned down any Ewoks that came too close. It never even crossed their minds that the Ewoks might present a threat. This was a catastrophic misjudgment because the destruction of the shield generator was one of the most decisive moments in the overall Battle of Endor. The Ewoks only carried primitive slings, spears, and catapults, but they had an uncanny awareness of their forest environment, which made them perfect for guerrilla warfare, and they adapted to new technology very quickly. They were crucial allies for the Rebel Special Forces because they balanced the numerical odds. The Ewoks were also fearless, taking heavy losses in the battle. This was also something the Imperial garrison underestimated because they could never have imagined the Ewoks' ingenuity. They literally took down Imperial walkers with giant logs. The very fun Star Wars Absolutely Everything You Need to Know reference book explains that these were actually anti-Gorax traps. Creatures of the Galaxy reveals that these giant humanoids sometimes attacked Ewok villages, so it wasn't the first time they experienced an existential threat. The lightsaber, an elegant weapon for a more civilized age. And while General Grievous may have collected them for less civilized reasons, you've got to admit there's just something about them. If you're anything like me, you've probably imagined what it would be like to hold one yourself. That's actually why I started Stickman Sabers. The goal was simple: make lightsabers that look amazing, being literally one-to-one replicas of the ones seen on screen, but are also built to handle real use, so you can duel without stressing about damaging them every time things get intense. They are all equipped with state-of-the-art pixel technology, giving off an incredibly bright light that will light up the darkest rooms out there, and obviously have the iconic hum that just feels right the moment you switch it on. And for a limited time, if you pick one up, you'll also get 2 combat sabers for free. If you've ever thought about starting your own collection, this is a pretty good place to start. Links in the description, and now, let's get back to the video. The Imperials also misunderstood the Rebel fleet's response. As soon as their ships emerged from hyperspace, they realized it was a trap. However, the Empire expected the Rebel ships to immediately scatter and attempt to withdraw. As we saw in Return of the Jedi, that's not what happened. Eventually, Admiral Ackbar ordered his forces to concentrate all fire on the Executor. Meanwhile, Lando Calrissian and Gold Squadron led the Rebel starfighters into a dogfight inside the Imperial formation. The Imperials should probably still have won this head-to-head fight, but they persistently underestimated Rebel pilots and the quality of their ships. There's no denying that an Imperial Star Destroyer outguns a Mon Cal cruiser. However, the Rebels' capital ships had decentralized command centers and outstanding shields. They were robust enough to survive while their X-Wing, B-Wing, and A-Wing squadrons drew fire and distracted the Imperial forces. Finally, there's no doubt that the Empire underestimated Admiral Ackbar. Firstly, he was an alien, and this alone was enough for the Imperials to doubt his abilities. However, he was also a former slave, as we learn from the Clone Wars and Rebels. Ackbar gained a deep knowledge of Imperial doctrine from his enslavement on Grand Moff Tarkin's ship. However, the Empire failed to recognize him as anything but a political figure. This was a massive error, as Ackbar proved himself over and over as an elite battlefield commander. He also led the New Republic to victory over the Empire at the Battle of Jakku. Ackbar still gets flack from some fans, but I think he was a great military leader. The Empire's initial plan was perfectly viable, but they had no plan B. They also fought the wrong fight on land and in space. Let's look at the Imperial garrison on Endor first. The stormtroopers had plenty of firepower and supporting artillery, but they were totally unsuited to forest warfare. If we compare them to the clone troopers on Kashyyyk in Revenge of the Sith, it's obvious how misguided this was. The craziest aspect is that the forest troopers actually exist in canon. Chuck Wendig's novel Aftermath: Life Debt features Imperial stormtroopers with special environmental training who wear camouflaged armor. This is probably because the Imperials took the Wookiees a lot more seriously than the Ewoks. In their hubris, they decided that they didn't need to assign a specialized unit to protect the shield generator of their most important superweapon. The stormtroopers and scout troopers wear their conventional white armor, which is laughably inappropriate for the setting. However, in their defense, if it wasn't for the Ewoks, they would have successfully ambushed the Rebel sabotage team. But this goes back to our first point about underestimating their opponents. It's worth noting that the Empire's entire military ethos had evolved from the Clone Wars because they had different objectives. The galactic-wide conflict was over, so the Empire wanted to maintain subjugation. That's how they came to adopt the Tarkin Doctrine, which favored the projection of force to suppress populations. In the canon novel, Tarkin, the title character literally says that the Empire doesn't just need highly trained specialists. In his words, they also require the service of a vast military dedicated to upholding the laws necessary to ensure galactic harmony. Basically, the Empire had quality over quantity. Their equipment is also a massive downgrade from the Clone Wars era. We can see this in Episode 4 when troopers literally walk into door frames because their optics are bad. Luke and Han also complain when they wear the armor, but the most damning criticism comes from Captain Rex in Star Wars Rebels. In Season 2, Episode 15, he wears one and immediately describes it as garbage. Their helmets provided poor peripheral vision, which was lethal on Endor's moon because of the Rebels' asymmetrical tactics. Ewoks were literally jumping out of the bush onto stormtroopers before they even spotted them. Ironically, Palpatine boasted to Luke that a legion of his finest troopers was waiting on the moon for the Rebel saboteurs. Emperor Palpatine also curtailed his space fleet from efficiently engaging the rebels. In various legend sources, Admiral Piet is described as being uneasy with the Emperor's plan, but he's too disciplined to criticize it. He was under orders to hold position, maintain the encirclement, and let the Death Star take out the rebel fleet with its super laser. We've already spoken about how the Imperials underestimated the rebel response. Instead of scattering and becoming cannon fodder, their starfighters flew into the heart of the storm. This massively reduced the capabilities of the Star Destroyer fleet because they weren't as effective against close, fast-moving targets. They also risked experiencing crossfire in a confusing and chaotic environment. The Star Destroyers were stuck defending the Death Star while it recharged its super laser, but this reduced their effectiveness. The Imperials also failed to respect the skill of the rebel pilots, something that has cost them again and again. They could have swarmed the rebels with their own squadrons of TIE fighters and interceptors. Yes, we know from many canon sources, including the canon complete starfighters and vehicles, that most TIEs notoriously have no shields, but they would have eventually ground down the rebel squadrons through sheer attrition and suffocated them. Instead, the Imperials hold their starfighters back to defend the Death Star, an unbelievably awful decision. It was also incredibly dumb to use the Death Star in this way. Sure, it lured the rebels into a trap, but placing it in harm's way was insane from a conventional military standpoint. The station commander, Moff Jerjerrod, is visibly uncomfortable with the situation because he knows the new Death Star isn't ready. The Emperor put it as the center point of the battle instead of using it as a support weapon to prevent the rebels from retreating. This greatly reduced the capabilities of the Star Destroyers because they weren't able to engage at will. Of course, we know that this was a political decision by Emperor Palpatine, not a military one, so let's get on that next. Many generals say that wars aren't won or lost on the battlefield. The Empire had every advantage over the Rebel Alliance at Endor with ground and air superiority. But there was one aspect that was totally out of the control of their military commanders. Their head of state, Emperor Palpatine, had ulterior motives and effectively used the entire battle as a scapegoat to lure Luke Skywalker onto the second Death Star. That's why he deliberately leaked information about the battle station being under construction. As Mon Mothma said in Episode 6, many Bothans died for this information. Unfortunately, despite the nobility of their sacrifice, it was all a setup. Yes, the Emperor was more than happy to destroy the Rebel fleet, but this was never his primary objective. That's why he actively curtailed his generals and admirals. Palpatine wanted the shield generator to come down because he knew Luke was on his way. That's also why he held his Star Destroyers back. Everything was proceeding as he had foreseen, until it suddenly didn't. Palpatine underestimated Luke's ability to resist the lure of the dark side. The Return of the Jedi revised novelization makes this even clearer for us. It reveals how he planned to replace Darth Vader with his son. The space battle is a deliberate ploy to break Luke emotionally and to incite rage within him. The Rise of Skywalker novelization also reinforces how Palpatine engineers these galactic-wide crises for his benefit. His motivations during the Battle of Exegol with Rey are very similar, but love and self-sacrifice defeated the dark side in both scenarios. That's why Palpatine deliberately picks a setting with a gigantic window, so that Luke can see the rebels under severe pressure and his friends being destroyed. Palpatine wanted to seduce Luke to the dark side by inciting his fury and hatred. A canon novel, Lords of the Sith by Paul S. Kemp, explains how this is a natural cycle for the Sith. The rule of two isn't just about maintaining the secret of the Order's existence, it's also about survival of the fittest. We typically think of the apprentice usurping the master, like Darth Sidious killing Darth Plagueis, but it works both ways, as Palpatine proved by ruthlessly betraying Count Dooku with Anakin Skywalker. Betray or be betrayed. We know from Episode 5 that Vader is already scheming against Palpatine. His iconic line, "Join me and together we can rule the galaxy as father and son," proves this. Luke's ability to resist the dark side is truly remarkable, although he flirts with it briefly when the Emperor incites him to strike him down. But Palpatine's hubris manifests in an even more devastating way for the Empire. He totally disregarded Vader's capacity to return to the light. The Emperor may have been inadvertently responsible for another reason why the Imperial fleet suffered catastrophic losses at Endor. Let's jump forward again to the Rise of Skywalker. During the Battle of Exegol, the Palpatine clone's aura has a huge impact on his subordinates and foes alike. The fanatical Sith Eternal work cohesively under his dark side influence. He doesn't use mind control in the strictest sense of the definition, but his use of manipulation through the Force streamlines their efficiency. Everything devolves into chaos after his eventual death. Meanwhile, the canon Shadow of the Sith novel explains that light side characters near Exegol experienced a loss of clarity and crushing pressure. It was like an inexplicable psychological burden they couldn't shake. There's no confirmation in any canon source that Palpatine used similar methods at Endor. However, if we go back to Timothy Zahn's original Thrawn trilogy, we get some fascinating insights. In the early stages of Heir to the Empire, Captain Palaeon discusses with Grand Admiral Thrawn how the Imperial fleet essentially fell apart after the Emperor's death. He notes how chaos erupted and hints that the Emperor's presence held them together. Zahn strongly implies that Palpatine's dark side influence had a profound impact on his commanders. We must remember that this isn't canon, but it is very consistent with what eventually goes down in the sequel trilogy, so I think it's fair to assume that his presence had a similar influence on the Imperial forces in Endor. Let me know what you think in the comments. Another key reason why the Empire loses the Battle of Endor is that its entire chain of command suffers destruction. First, there's the devastating loss of Darth Vader's flagship, the Executor, when an A-Wing crashes into the bridge. This kills the fleet's conventional military commander, Admiral Firmus Piet. He was effectively third in Endor's Imperial chain of command under Emperor Palpatine and Darth Vader. It's easy to overlook his death, but it was massively significant. First, the Executor was a shocking loss. According to Starships and Speeders, this Star Dreadnought had a crew of over 280,000. As it was Darth Vader's personal ship, you can bet that many of these were the Empire's best and brightest. The Executor was a massive blow on a symbolic level, but even without it, the Empire should have had enough to win. They still had about 30 Imperial Star Destroyers, which outnumbered and outgunned the Rebels' 20 capital ships, as well as their supporting corvettes, frigates, and gunships. Of course, it would have been a closer battle, but they had a clear numerical advantage. However, the Emperor and Darth Vader also died on the Death Star before the appointment of a new fleet commander. The Empire over-centralized its command structure at an enormous cost. In their hubris, they assumed the battle station was invincible, and Palpatine believed that he was infallible. Even the Death Star's destruction didn't have to be the decisive moment in the battle, but it was because Palpatine, Vader, and other leading Imperials like Moff Jared were on board at the time. This created an insurmountable power vacuum because nobody knew how to react. Jason Fry's canon short story, The Levels of Power, reveals that Admiral Ray Sloane waited for orders from the Death Star, but it was destroyed before they came. Very quickly, the fleet fell into chaos, and multiple Star Destroyers were destroyed, including the Devastator with Admiral Montferrat on board. Sloane then assumed command as the fleet's ranking officer and ordered the surviving ships to travel to the Anaj fleet. She wanted to avoid more unnecessary losses, but she also thought they would re-engage the rebels there. So even then, the Imperials didn't consider this to be the definitive end of this conflict. The Empire as a political entity may have disintegrated after Endor, but they didn't need to lose the battle itself. So far in this video, we've looked at the Empire's failure to win the Battle of Endor from an Imperial perspective. It's easy to say that their dumb strategies, ineptitude, and pride cost them the battle. These factors definitely had a significant impact, but that doesn't give the Rebel Alliance enough credit. Their bravery deserves respect, because they gave everything against all odds in a last-ditch attempt to liberate the galaxy. In Episode 6, Admiral Ackbar almost orders his forces to retreat after the Death Star vaporizes the Nautilus and the Liberty. But Lando Calrissian convinced him that this was their last chance of taking down the Empire. He persuaded Ackbar to bring his ships into close contact with the Imperial fleet, knowing that they were outgunned. Ackbar understood that his fleet wouldn't last long in close quarters with the Star Destroyers, but he gave the order anyway. This was unbelievably brave because they had no idea if their ground team would succeed in taking down the shield generator. There were many moments of individual bravery. One of the most significant was Green Squadron leader Arvel Krynard's heroic sacrifice. His A-Wing suffered catastrophic damage as the Executor's shields began to fail. Krynard made the split-second decision to steer his starfighter into the capital ship's unprotected bridge. This decapitated its command, and the Executor spiraled uncontrollably toward Endor. Krynard had time to eject, but opted to give his life for the greater good, in a truly emotional and inspiring moment. Many other starfighter pilots show similar courage. Wedge Antilles, Lando Calrissian, and Nien Nunb continue their runs into the Death Star superstructure despite overwhelming fire. The Falcon keeps going even as the superweapon is exploding around it. On the ground, the Rebels and the Ewoks also showed remarkable courage. Leia refused to quit despite suffering a blaster wound, and their troops maintained their composure against the odds. Love 'em or hate 'em, there's no denying that the Ewoks were the real heroes of the Battle of Endor's moon. Their tribes united to liberate their home from an adversary with unimaginable technological superiority. There's a heartbreaking moment in Episode 6 when one Ewok stops fighting to mourn his companion's death. But then he returns to the fray as he demonstrates their unbelievable conviction. The Rebel Alliance had more to fight for at Endor because they knew this was their chance to liberate the galaxy from tyranny. They desperately wanted freedom, and even if they lost, there would have been another spark eventually, because that's how resistance movements work. In Rogue One, all the good guys essentially make the ultimate sacrifice because they know it's worth it. And it is. At the end of Return of the Jedi, we see the celebrations across many worlds after the battle. Don't forget, this wasn't even the true end of the battle, never mind the war. The Battle of Jakku was when the Empire finally officially lost to the New Republic. Meanwhile, there was still a cleanup to do on Endor. We know from the Shattered Empire comic book series that Han Solo led a team to take out a group of Imperial holdouts on the far side of the moon, the very next day. But the rebels simply had a greater will to win, and the significance of this shouldn't be underestimated.
Oh, and again, for a limited time, every Stickman saber purchase comes with 2 additional combat sabers, so you're more than ready for your own duels. If that sounds like something you'd want to look into, the link's in the description.